Chapter 9. Is this the real black hole? They seemed to ride 2 more days before George asked, "Does anyone see what I see?" Everyone looked out their windows and gasped as they saw something that appeared to be the black hole. It was at a far distance away, but they were sure they were seeing the black hole. George started to pick up speed, but Captain Jim asked, "George, you do remember that we need to conserve fuel, don't you?" George says, "Just for a second. I forgot." "How are we doing on it?" George says, "We are down by about 25%. We'll probably have to call for a refueler ship to meet us. Just be careful." George says, "Yes, sir." As they were getting closer, Captain Jim says, "George, slow down." "Sir, I'm not doing that. I tried to slow down, but it doesn't work." As they got closer, they were going at top speed. Everyone was watching as they got closer and closer. They remembered when they came through the first time that they had entered at a fast speed and they waited, holding their breaths. When they went into the black hole, it knocked them all off their feet. Al and George were knocked out for a few seconds. Greg gave them something to bring them to their normal selves. The ship slowed down to its normal speed after a few seconds. Everyone was looking around, trying to see something familiar, but they had entered the first time just before dark. Nothing seemed familiar. George says, "I don't know how to guide us. What do you want me to do?" They saw caves in the walls around them. Some seemed to have lights in them. There were very dim lights glowing along the way in brilliant colors of blue, red, purple, yellow, and orange. They seemed to be just the coloring of the rocks or whatever the walls were made of. It was all very pretty and soothing. Then they realized they had entered a tunnel going to their left. George says, "This doesn't seem right. I think we should have kept going straight. I have no control over where we are headed." Ted says, "I think you're right. From what I learned of our flight path through the first time, we went straight through." Captain Jim says, "Then just stop." "I've tried. We are at the holding pattern on my console, but we are still moving." Pete says, "We need to stop now. The tunnel's getting narrower. Soon we'll be wedged in." Just then they came to a full stop. Everyone let out a deep breath. George asked, "Do you think the powers that be will back us up?" "I certainly don't know how to do it." Captain Jim says, "Let's just wait and see. At least take a few deep breaths before you all pass out again." George asks, "Captain, do you know how to back the ship up?" "No, only when we're coming in for a landing." George says, "But that is using the gravity of the planet and some maneuvers we do to slow us down." Pete asks, "What do we do now? I can feel the air around moving towards that narrow end. You don't think we're moving?" Al asks, "Do you think if we could push the ship, there's enough room to turn us around?" Pete asks, "Maybe. But who or what can we get to do the pushing?" Al stands thinking and says, "You and I. The way I'm thinking is we get the small crafts out and you and I will man them. Then we can go out and push the ship a little at a time until we get it turned around enough to keep going straight out." Ted says, "I see what you mean, but it'll be slow going, and if the draft in the air picks up, we could be heading out that small tunnel." Captain Jim says, "First, let me say I don't like it. Could go wrong in so many ways. Well, it might work. How many of those small crafts do we have?" George says, "They are for 2 men. So since there are 6 of us, there should be 3. Or there could be as many as 6. All 6 can't go, but 4 could. That would give us more power." Al says, "No, we need 4 inside to help by moving the controls. They will be hard to turn against the airflow." Captain Jim says, "That's just the reason your idea's wrong." Al says, "We have those long lines we can use to tether the crafts to the ship. It's too bad we don't have a hatch on the other side of the ship. Then we could each go out on a different side." Captain Jim says, "I'll suit up and be at the doorway to help you back inside." Al says, "I think you would be more of use here in the control room." "I don't care what you think. The others can handle anything that comes up, or they can call and say they need help. It'll be my way or you're not going out." Al says, "Okay, Pete, are you willing to go out with me?" I should have asked before. "Of course. I was willing from the first. Who else? They all have important jobs. Okay, let's get suited up." They suited up and got the small crafts out. They hooked each craft to a 100-yard metal safety cable and the other end to the safety bar on the spaceship. Pete got his craft out and got into it with the help of Al and the captain. Al got his ship out and climbed in with the captain's help. Then he hooked his craft to Pete's with a 25-yard safety line. They were ready, but reluctant to push off. The captain said to wait, and he said a prayer for their safe and useful trip. They were off, and soon learned their safety lines were too long. They managed to hook each one to the special hooks at each 10-foot length. They started pushing on the ship. At first, it didn't seem like they were going to move it. Then it gave in and started moving a little at a time. They were starting to get successful moves when they heard Greg say, "Pete, you and Al get back inside right now." Al says in his mic, "Are you kidding? We are just beginning to make headway." Greg says, "For your sake and all of our sake, get inside right now." Pete says, "Something's wrong. We better get inside now." They could feel the captain pulling them inside. Greg was helping. He was only wearing a space helmet with an oxygen tank on his back. Pete was the first in and started putting away his craft as the captain and Greg was helping Al. He heard Al yell out in pain. He turned to look, but Captain Jim was pushing Al's craft at him, and Greg was helping Al through the airlock into the main part of the spaceship. The captain closed the hatch, and he and Pete went into the airlock. When they got through and started taking off their spacesuits, they saw Al's suit just laying on the floor. Pete picked it up and put it away at the same time he put his away. He asked the captain, "What happened to Al? I heard him yell out in pain." The captain said as he finished putting away his suit, "He accidentally grabbed hold of the thermal pipe instead of the rail and burned his hand. I don't know how bad, just that Greg looked at it and said, 'That needs immediate attention.'" Pete asked, "Do you know why Greg insisted we come back in?" "We're starting to get the hang of it." "I'm not sure, just that they were seeing a drastic change in the airflow." Greg had brought Al back to the control room, had him sit at his desk, and gave him a pill to take. He said, "I don't want you to knock me out." Greg says, "That won't knock you out, but you will wish that it had. Now, this is going to hurt. The lining of your glove has melted into your flesh. The only way to remove it is to do it as fast as I can before it gets worse. So I'm going to give you shots around the wound. That'll numb it some. I will work as fast as I can. If it gets to be too much, tell me, and I'll let you rest a bit." Al says, "I'll do my best. You sound like it's going to hurt more than it does now." In a word, yes. Ready to start? Al says, in a word, no. Greg slowly removed what was left of his glove. Al made several noises of pain, but did not say a word. Greg was giving him the injections in his hand when Captain Jim and Pete came in. Pete grabbed the captain's shoulder when he saw the wound and what Greg was doing and said, "I may be sick." Al says, Go ahead and be sick for me while you're at it. Ted and George were as far away as they could get. Captain Jim asked, "What can you tell me about what's going on?" George asked, "Just seeing it for yourself is not enough?" Captain Jim says, "No, I meant about why Greg called them back in." Ted says, "Here, do you see these lines on this monitor? They are the movement lines in the atmosphere out there. They were almost non-existing before you went out. Are you saying we caused that?" Ted says, "No. I have two explanations for it, but I don't know which is right or if it's either one. First, maybe these just happened naturally and we came through at the wrong time, or second, someone or something made a mistake putting us into the wrong tunnel. Maybe we are just unlucky, which seems to be the case," inputted George. Captain Jim says, "How's it going to impact us now?" Ted says, "I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see." Pete asked, "Captain, what is that thermal pipe doing near that hatch? I've been researching and it should not be there." "Are you sure? I saw it and the heat was bad. I could feel it from where I was standing." They could all hear Al moaning and Greg talking softly. Captain Jim says, "Turn on some soft music and make sure Al can only barely hear it." He got some bottled water and started towards Greg and Al, but Greg shook his head and nodded toward Al. He had lain his head back in the chair and was asleep, but still feeling pain. Greg had finished with the injections and was slowly picking out bits of fabric from the wound. Then he washed it with something that apparently burned as Al moaned loudly. Greg then put some ointment on it and wrapped it. He went to where the others were standing and took one of the bottles of water from the captain, opened it, and drank the entire bottle without stopping. Greg said, "Don't ask me how he's doing or how well will he heal. I will have to say, I don't know. I used what I have in my bag to work with. I have nothing to work with for a burn that bad. Just keep saying your prayers. He'll sleep for about 4 hours. It should keep him out for 6 or 8, but the pain will break through at some point." Ted asked, "Do you want us to help get him to bed?" "No, I want him here where I can watch him." Captain Jim brought a large recliner from his office and asked, "Do you think this will work? It has heavy-duty magnets to keep it from sliding around and roll pillows for his arms." "Yes, that'll work great, if we can find a place to put it." They started working it into a space between the table and the storage cabinet. It worked great there, and there was room for Greg to work with him. They gently moved Al to the recliner. Greg was holding his hand and laid it down on one of the pillows. He put a blood pressure cuff on his right arm. He would have to pull the recliner out to get to his burned hand, but this way his hand wouldn't accidentally get bumped. George came in and said, "I thought you might want to use this." He had the IV pole for hanging glucose or a bottle of anything he needed. Greg said, "Thank you. I do need that. He's going to need to be hydrated, and I think I'll give him something for the pain a little later." I gave him a lot in his hand, and that pill was strong. Captain Jim says, "Okay. Now, Greg, you stay with Al. If we need you, we'll let you know. Now, George, how are we coming with the direction change?" George says, "We are moving in the right direction. I don't know how long it is going to take, but we need to be ready as soon as we get turned into the right direction. It could happen fast." Captain Jim says, "You keep your hand on the brake and the forward gear. I still have a bad feeling about this." George says, "We all have the same feeling, sir." Pete says, "I'm going back and see if I can get some part numbers off that thermal tube and find out what it's doing there." Captain Jim says, "Turn the air back on in that storage area and we'll both look at it and finish putting away the small craft. You're right. We do need to find out what it's doing there. It is dangerous." When they got back to the storage space, Pete asked, "What happened to the thermal pipe? It was right here by the exit steps." Captain Jim leans down and ran his hand over the area where they thought they had seen the pipe and says, "Feel right here." Pete got down and ran his hand in the same area. He looked at the captain and asked, "What is going on?" The captain had his finger to his mouth. They got busy and put away the small crafts and the safety lines. All the while they were opening cabinets and looking behind and under things. They stood looking around and the captain said, "Looks like we have everything put away properly. You wiped everything to remove all our fingerprints, didn't you? Our cleaning staff gives us negative points if they find any." Pete says, "Yes, I think I have that matter covered." They went into the airlock and closed the doors on both sides. Pete said as quietly as he could, "Do you think there's someone on board with us?" "I don't know where or how they got on board, but yes, I think we have hostile company on board," whispered the captain. Just then, George's voice came over the intercom. "Sir, we are getting ready to hit the fuel increase." Captain Jim says, "No, do not press that button." But they felt a jolt forward and then an immediate hard stop, as if they had hit something. They rushed to the control room. George was standing next to his control station. He was white and trembling and said, "Captain, I didn't touch anything. We jumped forward and hit something. I can't see what we hit. Honest, I didn't do anything." "My office. Everyone, as soon as you lock everything down, tight. Greg, I think you should stay with Al. I'll clue you in next." When they were in his office, he closed the door and pushed a security button and said, "Pete, help me make sure this office is secure." They opened every door and drawer in the office. George and Ted were looking at them as if they'd lost their minds. Pete said, "Seems to be clear, sir." They explained what they had found and what they thought. Ted asked, "Do you really think there's someone else on board?" Pete says, "Or something." Captain Jim says, "We will do our jobs as usual, but keep your eyes and ears open. Report anything unusual to me. Immediately. Now, George, I believe you will find that we have hit an invisible object, but if you climb slowly about 12 feet, we will be able to move slowly. I'll be standing next to you, handing you written instructions as we go. Now, Pete, I will send Greg in and you explain everything to him. Ted, you stay next to Al until Greg gets his instructions." They left the office and Pete called Greg into the office. Everyone seemed to be moving in slow motion, waiting for Greg to come out of the office. Greg came out and he was visibly angry. He didn't say a word, just walked over to Al and sat down. He turned and gave everyone a thumbs up. Captain Jim told George, "Slowly raise the nose up 12 feet. George asked, "What do you mean?" "We are against something." "Just follow my instructions." He raises his hands and made a gesture towards them and raised all 10 fingers twice to let them know he meant 20, not 12. George pushes up the nose lever and down on the fuel lever and watched the captain closely. He got the signal to level the nose and then the signal to move faster. They were then moving past the barrier that they had hit and were moving forward slowly. George asked, "Now what and how did you know what to do?" "We will be moving towards several tunnels. I'll let you know which one to take. We can move a little faster now. I'll try and keep you informed of the next move." He turned to Ted and asked, "Do you have our flight path through here when we came in?" "Yes. Do you think they're right?" "They haven't been so far. That's because it wasn't your eyes looking at them." Ted asked, "What do you mean?" "I don't think I understand, or I'm not sure even want to." Captain Jim says, I know exactly what I mean. Just keep watching the reverse flight plan and tell me at any time that we start to veer off. I may be wrong about this, and if I am, we are in a lot of trouble. They continue with George following the captain's hand signals and with Ted giving them a thumbs up. After some time, they were out of the black hole. Captain Jim breathed a sigh of relief and says, We are in the Milky Way. Now to find exactly where we need to get out and head home. All at once, there was a loud shout, and Al was yelling at Greg. He was saying, Who tied me up? What am I doing in this chair? Why is my hand bandaged? Greg had quickly given him an injection. Captain Jim had rushed over to help. They got him quiet, but his eyes looked scared and angry. Captain Jim called Pete over to help Greg and said, Keep him calm until I check on a couple of things. Then we can explain everything to him. Ted looked at Captain Jim and said, I can explain one thing, or maybe it's more than one. We have just passed through what, for a better term, a wrinkle in time. George says, I never heard the term before, but I just saw it took us nearly 30 months to get through the black hole. Captain Jim says, I've heard the term, and most people that read a lot of science fiction has heard it also. I've always thought there might be such a thing. Ted says, George, that will explain the 30 months and the other times we can't account for. A wrinkle in time is where time gets folded over itself, and there is a loss of time or time not accounted for. There is an opposite effect, where you gain time. Greg says, Al is going to be really at a loss. I'm going to get some warm water and start soaking the bandage off his hand. I just hope it hasn't grown into his hand. Captain Jim asked, George, can you and Ted find a place to sit down so we can get our heads straight? George asked, What about our guest? I think we left him behind, but stay alert. I'll see if I can stir up something for us to eat. Pete says, Greg says to help you. He'll call if he needs help. Captain Jim says, Okay, you start fixing something to eat. I need to take a short break, and then I'll help you. He left to go to the second level. Greg set the warm water on the table and moved Al's chair out so he could get beside it to work on Al's hand. He asked, Al, can you hear me? Al nodded slightly. Greg asked, Do you know what happened to your hand? Al shook his head, still looking scared. Greg softly told him what happened up to the point where he had bandaged his hand. This at first seemed to frighten him more. Then he seemed to understand. Greg told him he needed to soak the bandage to get it off. Al said in frightened words, Will hurt, yes? Greg said, I'll do my best to keep the pain as low as possible. First, I will put your hand in this pan of warm water. It may cause a little discomfort at first. Then the warm water will feel good. After it soaks for a few minutes, I'll slowly start removing the bandage around the edges. Any time the pain is too much, let me know, okay? Al said a weak yes. Then he asked, Can I have something to eat or drink while it's soaking? Greg smiled, patted his knee, and called Pete to fix him something to eat and a weak cup of tea. Then he slowly lowered Al's hand into the warm water. After his hand was in the water only a few seconds, Al said, Feels good. Ted brought Al some buttered toast and a cup of tea. Al thanked him and started nibbling the toast. After his first bite, he smiled and said, Very good. Greg started slowly removing the bandage. First, unwrapping the outer bandage. It was slow going, as at some points the bandages were stuck together. He wasn't even at the wound yet. This really worried him. He said, Al, I'm going to see if I can find a piece of that toast while your hand is soaking a little more. I'll be back in a few minutes." Al smiled, put his toast down, and picked up his tea. Greg went to where Pete was putting butter on the toast and asked, "Will it upset you if I take a piece?" Pete said, "Help yourself. Here's the jelly." Then he poured Greg a cup of coffee. Pete asked, "How's it going?" Greg says, "Al is handling it better than me." "Did I hear Ted right, that we went through a wrinkle of time?" "Yes. Do you know about them?" Greg says, "Not much more than anyone that reads science fiction does. I've always thought it was just a term to make the story more interesting." Just then, Al called and said, "More toast, please." Greg chuckles and says, "He's getting better." He put jelly on 2 pieces and carried them to Al and says, "Eat slowly. Your stomach is empty, and eating too fast may cause you to get sick." Al laughs and says, "Okay, I will share." Greg says, "No, I better get busy and get this bandage off." Al asks, "Heard something about 30 years. Can you tell me what I missed?" Greg answers, "Actually, you only missed a couple more hours than the rest of us. Don't worry about it. By the time we get this hand taken care of, we will probably land and bring everyone up to date. Now, let me get back to work." Al says, "I see you don't want to tell me everything. I will wait. But just for your information, I can handle anything you want to tell me." Greg didn't say anything, just kept unwrapping his hand. He was getting surprised as there didn't seem to be any blood on the bandage. When he got it unwrapped, all that was left was the actual bandage. He took a deep breath and slowly lifted the bandage, and to his surprise, there was nothing there. No blood, no scar, no sign of a burn. He just sat there holding Al's hand. Al looked at him and asked, "What is wrong? Is it bad?" Greg called Pete over to look. He took Al's hand and looked at it closely and said to Al, "You lucky person. There isn't even a scar." Al asked, "Should there be a scar? I didn't see it before." Pete says, "I did see it before, and on most people, there would be a large, bad scar." Ted and George came over and looked at his hand. They had seen the raw, burned mess and could not believe what they were seeing. Ted says, "You are really lucky." Captain Jim came back and looked at his hand and says, "Okay, no more excuses to get out of your job." He then turned and walked away, shaking his head. Al was wondering just what he had missed, but he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. George and Ted had found a small moon, just on the outskirts of the Milky Way. It, of course, was not a place they could live, but it was a place to rest and get their bearings and decide what their next step would be. They all sat, ate scrambled eggs, toast, and drank hot coffee. No one said a word. They were waiting for Captain Jim to say something. He finally said, "I don't know where to begin. Things are so scrambled in my head. I know you want to know what happened, that I found a way to guide us out of the black hole. As I sit here, there are so many things I don't understand. What I can tell you is this. When we went through the black hole the first time, I felt like someone else was in my head with me. After that, I was never alone in my head. There were times I was fighting to get control. Sometimes I thought I had gotten control, and then I would realize I still wasn't alone. I know that at times you thought I had a problem, but you just don't know how bad it was. I would gain control just enough to act normal, but if I tried to alert you, I would lose control again. When I caused Al to burn his hand, that hurt me so bad that I must have strength I didn't know I had and somehow gain control after Pete and I went to check on the thermal pole. I couldn't say anything at that point, as I knew I would lose what control I had gained. I saw things about to happen, Started using what power I had to warn you. So that is how I knew about the barrier we hit and how to move forward and out of the black hole. If you're going to ask if I have complete control now, well, all I can say is, for now, I do and don't think there's any chance of losing it again. Now, let's see if we can determine where we are and how to get home. That had been a long speech, and he was exhausted, but they could tell he was on guard. Pete asked George, "How much fuel do we have left?" George replies, "We have used 3/4 of our fuel. There's still some in one of our reserve tanks, but it will soon be moved to the main tank." Greg asked, "Has anyone tried contacting Earth?" Ted says, "We have, but the frequency indicators are saying we are using the wrong codes." Al asks, "Captain, does that sound to be true, or are you some way interfering?" "Al, I wish I could say for sure I'm not interfering, but I don't believe I am. I can usually feel it when I'm doing something." Greg asked, "Is there a chance that the time warp or the wrinkle in time has something to do with it?" Ted replies, "You may have hit on something. Depending on how long we have been gone, Earth may have changed the codes. There are some codes that I've been looking for that lets an old code system to break through. I've not been able to find them." Captain Jim asked, "I don't suppose you've looked in the safe under my desk?" Ted says, "Yes, I've looked for the safe under your desk, but I couldn't find it." "So you are saying there is one under your desk?" He was quiet for some time, and they could tell he was struggling with something. They just talked among themselves, keeping an eye on the captain. Finally, he said, "It wasn't what you thought. I was just struggling with my memory. I thought I had lost it. Give me a little time and I'll show you." That was not what they wanted to hear, but they just talked among themselves, keeping an eye on him. Greg had quietly, and moving out of sight of the others except Pete, removed a syringe from his bag and was holding it where only Pete could see it. He nodded his approval. Captain Jim says, "Pete, you and Ted come into my office and I'll show you the hiding place for the code book." Ted asks, "Why only us? Why are you questioning my orders?" Ted says, "I am sorry. I did not mean to question your orders." This little exchange had given Pete a chance to palm the syringe that Greg had fixed. He almost got caught as the captain turned suddenly and looked at Greg. The three of them went into the office. The captain closed and locked the door and said, "See, the reason I only wanted you two, there isn't room for more." There was room for more. Then he said, "Also, Greg needs to stay with Al, and you know George. There are times he isn't worth having around." This sent chills down Pete's back, and Ted looked at the captain with a look that Ted didn't recognize. The captain said, "Ted, open the bottom left drawer and remove it." Ted says, "Sir, I have already looked there several times. In fact, then you didn't know what you were looking for." Ted opened and removed the drawer and set it aside. "Now, take your fist and punch very hard on the section that's under the drawer." Ted did and felt something move. "Now, feel just inside of the opening and pull out that piece of fiberboard." Ted did as he was directed and saw a small red book. He removed it. It couldn't have had more than 10 sheets of paper in it. But Ted didn't open it. He gave it to the captain. The captain used his thumb on a small white dot and the book opened. He handed it to Ted. He walked over and opened the door, and as Pete walked out, he said, "Pete, you can now give the syringe back to Greg." There was complete silence. No one knew what to say. The captain said, "Greg, I don't blame you and Pete for that little trick. I hope you will continue staying on your toes until you're sure I am well. Now, Ted, See if you can unlock the new Earth code so we can go home. I hope I can prove myself before then." Greg started to say something, but he waved him away. Al says quietly to Greg, "I must have missed out on a lot. I'm not sure who I need to trust." Captain Jim says, "Al, you haven't missed a lot. But please keep an open mind as you hear it. I'm sorry. I did not intend to hurt your hand, and I will always regret it." He went into the office and closed the door. Greg hesitated a couple of minutes and then walked over and opened the door and said, "For your own sake, this door must remain open." Captain Jim says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot." Ted was flipping through the pages of the book and said, "This is not going to be easy. There are a lot of codes in this book, and they're not labeled as to what they're referring to. I know some are fake codes, and if you use a fake code too many times in a row, you will get locked out." Al asked, "Is it possible that the captain knows? Maybe I could ask him." Greg takes Al into the little pantry alcove and explained as much as he could about what has been going on. Al acts a little surprised. "Then the dreams I was having were more or less true." Greg says, "I don't know what your dreams were about." Al says, "Pretty much just what you told me. They seemed more detailed than what you've told me." Greg says, "I just wanted you to have an idea and not all the details. I guess you were not completely out of it." Just then, the captain walked in and said, "What is going on? When are we going to get started? Ted, why haven't you used that code book? Where is our reverse code? Where is the food I ordered hours ago? Why is everyone just standing around looking at me? I want some action right now." Al walked over to him and put his hand on the captain's shoulder and said, "Jim, you need to calm down. He didn't get the sentence finished before a fist came up and knocked him to the ground. Al lay there a couple of minutes looking at the captain. He slowly got up, watching the captain, and said, "I guess I've missed more than I thought." The captain didn't seem to hear him or notice what he had done, but it seemed to calm the captain down. Greg handed him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He also held out a pill to him and said, "When you get a chance, you need to take your vitamin. You missed it this morning." Captain Jim took the food and pill and sat down and finished everything off, including the pill. Everyone tried to appear busy. They didn't want him yelling at them again. After he had finished, he handed Greg a key and said, "I'm going to take a nap." Greg asked, "Where did you get this key?" "It was in my pocket." "You should be more careful. You have a hole in that pocket." Greg reached into his pocket, and there was a hole in it. That didn't make sense, as he had checked it before putting the key in it. Captain Jim went to his room and blew Greg a kiss as Greg locked the door. When Greg got back to the office, everyone was discussing Captain Jim. The intercom came on, and the captain said, "If you want to discuss me, you should turn off the intercom. Besides, you are disturbing my nap." George reached over and turned off the intercom and said, "Al, if you don't mind, I need to lay down on your lounge for a little while." Ted says, "Pete, you know codes and have worked with flight patterns. Why don't you help me, and maybe Greg and Al can scramble us up some food?" Al and Greg got busy and fixed a meal of fried chicken thighs and gravy, instant mashed potatoes, green beans, corn, and biscuits. They set everything on the table. Greg says, "You guys wash up and I'll go get the captain." The captain says, "No need, I'm here." The smell of food woke me up. Greg felt in his pocket and the key was still there. The captain had showered and shaved and was in a fresh, ironed uniform. He says, "When you've finished eating, you should all shower and put on clean clothes. It'll make you feel like a new man." They all sat down and soon had the table cleaned of all food. Greg brought out a peach cobbler. They cleaned that up as well. Ted says, "Captain, do you have any idea how to find the right code? I made a count of the pages, and there are 15, and there are 30 codes on each page. We will be shut out for good unless I accidentally find the correct code." Captain Jim says, "Of course I do. Why didn't you ask before?" Never mind. Don't answer that. Let me see. First and last. That's it. First and last of what? That doesn't help. Yes, it does. Get a pen and paper and bring the book here. Ted did as he was told, although he was skeptical. He brought everything to the table, set them down, and sat across from the captain. Captain Jim asked, "What is the first code?" JOI6. That is not enough. Okay. What's the last code? MCKHHH. That's too many. How is that helping? Captain Jim asked, "How many letters do we need?" Usually it's 6. Could be 7. Captain Jim says, JOI6MCKHHH. Do you see the hint there? Ted, getting frustrated, said, "No, it doesn't tell me anything." Captain Jim asked, "What is the only number you see?" Ted says, 6. What does it mean? Oh, is it saying there are 6 letters in the code? How does that help? That leaves 9. What if you remove the 3 H's? Would that leave 6? Ted says, "Yes, that does work. But I bet there are other combinations that work out also. But are they the first and the last? That is what I remember about what I was told when I was given the book." Ted says, "Okay, I'll try it, but if it doesn't work, we will only have 2 tries left." Captain Jim says, "Oh, you of little faith. Before you try, they will need to know a lot of things, like the amount of fuel we have left and just where we are. I can answer the fuel question, or rather, George can, but we have no idea where we are." Captain Jim says, "There is another question they'll ask. That could be a problem. Do any of you know my code? I'm afraid I've forgotten it." Ted says, "Well, I guess we'll just have to cross those bridges as we get to them." He messes around with the controls and told Pete to stand by. He asked, "George, do you know how much fuel we have and just how far it'll go?" George says, "Yes. We have just over a quarter of capacity, and will take us about a fourth of the way. If Earth is where we think it is." That doesn't sound so good. Al, do you know any way to make it go further? Al says, "Maybe we can find a good tailwind." Everyone chuckled. "Captain, have you remembered your code?" "No, but maybe Greg knows it. Greg, you must have used it to get into the drug safe." Greg says, "We can try it." He wrote it on a piece of paper and gave it to the captain. Ted says, "Well, here goes." He entered the 6-letter code and waited. He gave them a thumbs up and said into the mic, "This is Spaceship Dark Shadow, 888B77H11, requesting permission to talk to Commander Brown." He waited and turned on the speakers so everyone could hear. He said, "Could you repeat that? Our connection is bad." From the speaker they heard, "I said, who gave you permission to use this coded line? This is Captain James Allen. We are in space and can't seem to get through on the regular code. Have you changed it for a reason?" "I don't answer questions. What is your code?" Ted says, PP9QRR. "Now get Commander Brown for me. This is an emergency." I can't get Commander Brown on. He is no longer with us. Ted asks, so he finally retired? No. The commander passed about a year ago. Captain Jim says, we're sorry to hear that. Then may we speak to Admiral David Schiffer. Admiral Schiffer retired 6 months ago. Captain Jim says, then get someone on this call, and if I don't talk to someone in the next 5 minutes, you will never retire. But you will be in the brig the rest of your good-for-nothing life. Greg was shaking him and saying, Captain, are you awake? Talk to me. Please, talk to me. Let me know that you're awake again. Hey, everyone, I think the captain is waking up. Everyone was in the room trying to talk at once. Captain Jim asked, what am I doing in bed? Why is everyone in here talking at once, and why am I hooked up to all these machines? Greg says, everyone outside the door except Al. I will need your help with the machines. Captain Jim says, no, I don't want Al anywhere around my machines. What are all the machines doing in my room? Al, you know better. Get him out and get someone to take these machines out of here. He was tossing and turning and slinging his arms and trying to kick. Al! Greg says loudly, everyone back in here and hold him down while I give him something to calm him down. Everyone was back in the room trying to hold him down. He was screaming at them, saying what he would do to them later. He again tried his best to kick Al. Greg finally gave him an injection. As he started to calm down, Al asks, how long will he be out? Greg replies, I didn't give him enough to knock him out, only enough to calm him down, so that I can talk to him and let him know what has happened. George asked, do you need me any longer? I need to get back to the control room. Greg answers, you go ahead. Does anyone else need to get back to their position? Ted says, I really should, but I can stay a little longer. Al says, I don't need to, but I think he has a problem with me being here, so I should leave too. Pete says, I can stay. If they need me, they can call me and I can go. I'll try to help. I don't know much about all these machines. Al says, okay, I'll wait outside the door. Greg says, okay, we have a plan. Give me a minute to compose myself and I'll try to talk to him. He walked outside the door, went down on his knees as he had been doing for months, and said a prayer to God to help him. He, as well as the others, had spent many days and nights outside this door in prayers.